Okay.
Sideways though.
I'm sideways?
Yeah. Just turn your phone. There we go. That's better.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, what I was saying is, the directions that Rorty goes in after this book gives you maybe a little bit of an insight into what the point is with his approach to pragmatism, what's at stake, and so on. In addition to the kind of literary theory stuff that he does in works like Contingency, what is it? Contingency, Irony, Solidarity,
Hmm.
book from I think 1989, so 10 years after this book. He also writes a book called Pragmatism as Anti-Authoritarianism.
Ah.
And in both of those books, he is more or less uh, proceeding from the belief that um, treating something that is non-human as the authority for human affairs,
Hmm.
actually maybe like a form of self-oppression or something like this. I mean, there's a kind of Nietzschean element to it. He often talks about pragmatism as the departure from non-human authorities.
Hmm.
And non-human authorities could mean something like the mind-independent world or capital T truth. But, it could mean um, a number of other things. Say, for instance, I suppose to a certain extent, treating certain constructs like the theory of evolution as completely determinate of human behavior or whatever would also, I suppose, be a non-human authority, not because humans are somehow like mini gods or something like that, but
Hmm.
probably simply because even nominally um, non-metaphysical stories like the theory of evolution are nonetheless a story.
Uh-huh.
And it's also a story that is often told from the point of view of believing that we can get to mind independent reality,
Hmm.
right? So that, you know, his point is not that humans are somehow completely free in a sort of, oh, I don't know, existential or, I suppose existential sense, or maybe even a sort of postmodern sense or something like that. It's more like um, we always have to remember that there are these characters in our stories that take the form of things like mind independent reality, but we have to understand that we only have access to these sorts of things through our stories, right?
Yeah.
And so we can treat them as non-human authorities, but in treating them as non-human authorities, we're forgetting that we're the ones that are treating them as characters in a story to begin with,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it's that sort of thing. It's actually kind of similar to when I teach student composition and they're having trouble because they have some structural idea that they like that they want to uh, implement in their piece, but then they start having trouble writing the piece because they can't quite, get the structure out or can't quite find how best to express it. Or it might even be the sort of thing where they would like to do something, but then they decide they can't do it because it doesn't fit the idea of the piece or it doesn't fit the structure of the piece. And I always,
Mm-hmm.
you're the one who came up with that structure. It has no authority over you other than the authority that you've given it.
Right.
And that's basically Rorty's position here too, with respect to any kind of non-human authority. History is sometimes treated as a non-human authority if we're talking about like Hegelian meta-narratives, some kind of story about how history is developing or something
Hmm.
like that. And so even approaches like the linguistic turn, which, as I said a couple of weeks ago, is actually one step closer to pragmatism because now we're not asking questions about truth independent of human minds. We're asking questions about language, which has a history, which has a contingent social ontology, and so on. But nonetheless, in say the work of Quine and Sellers, at least with respect to one kind of regress stopper, either sensations or meanings, language is itself treated as an authority because
Mm-hmm.
what they're trying to do is uncover something of the uh, impartial, neutral, logical structure of language. And the same can be
Mm-hmm.
with history, right? So, like, you often see people talking about history as being, so like a historical analysis, or something like, say, the genealogy of morals, which isn't exactly historical, but
Yeah.
it's talking about how ideas develop,
Mm-hmm.
very often taken to be the opposite of, say, a logical analysis, which is to say that in a logical analysis, what we're trying to do is come to timeless truths that give us the structure of morality or the structure of knowledge or whatever. But if something can be shown to be necessarily true, then it's independent of time and history and culture and all that. And
Right.
often historical analysis or genealogical analysis is often taken to be uh, um, a way of getting around that because
Mm.
it's no longer about timeless truths, it's about historical truths. But what Rorty would say is that history or language are very often also treated as non-human authorities. That is
Mm.
to say, if you're telling a story about history develops or something like that, or if you're trying to get to some completely, unbiased, neutral perspective on language, essentially what you're doing is treating language, which is really just a human tool, as a non-human authority,
Right.
right?
So would you say that
And,
about
and just to bring it into more familiar terms, it's the same with writing a piece of music, right? You're treating the structure or the work or what it is to become as somehow having power over you.
yeah,
Well, you're the one who came up with it, but then the thing you come up with can turn around and
impose itself? Yeah.
authority over you if you're not careful with how you conceive of what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that,
So
yeah, go
like
ahead.
Chomsky's like generative grammar and stuff, would that be, a way of,
That would be treating language from the perspective of non-human authorities, because what
yeah.
they're trying to do is really, yeah, uncover some kind of universal. Um, uh, one way that Rorty talks about non-human authorities in a way that would include Chomsky as an example is that if what you're trying to do is, instead of, you know, explore different possible vocabularies or um, expand vocabularies or change vocabularies, if in addition to doing all that, you're doing it for the purpose of finding the final perfect vocabulary,
Mm-hmm.
then you're treating it as a non-human authority, because the final vocabulary, the idea that you could ever get to the last word on a
Yeah.
subject,
Right.
is to treat that subject as being a sort of non-human authority, right? And
Right.
that's what Chomsky is trying to do, right? With the
Mhm.
universal grammar. There's
Yeah.
that even though he's treating it as an evolutionary adaptation and not some kind of metaphysical, truth grantor or something like that, to a certain extent, he's also treating evolution as a non-human authority because it's a perspective that thinks even if they don't have the final word on evolution or the final word on language, they're looking for the final word,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so in Contingency, Irony, Solidarity, he talks about um, how certain philosophers, but also certain artists, certain authors, um, are kind of slaves to that kind of authority because they think that it's possible to find the final word,
Mm.
right? And there you can start to think of like the way that, say, Webern talked about atonality or something, or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, anytime you make that kind of move, you're not really being a pragmatist. You're being a metaphysician, but you're just confused about that. That's what
Yeah. Uh-huh. All right. So, and then you would say that no one is willing to challenge that because then it would just result in chaos as opposed to.
Well, are you saying what are some arguments against Rorty's point?
Yeah, I'm like
Yeah.
thinking, right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the main thing is so one thing that people often have, or at least philosophers or certain kinds of scientists that are not scientists very often, when you talk to practicing scientists or not even scientists, but like people in applied sciences like medicine or something,
Hmm.
they often aren't really clear on what they're doing at a very abstract level.
Hmm.
you know. And so there are a lot of scientists or doctors, medical doctors or whatever, that are basically like metaphysical realists about knowledge and this kind of thing, you know.
Hmm.
But then there are a lot of scientists that understand that what they're doing isn't really an explanation or description of what exists. It is an activity that is constantly being revised
Yeah,
so that no theory is ever true. Every theory is just the best guess we've got,
right,
right? Now, it's important to say that it's not just a guess, it is the best guess.
right.
But just because it's a guess, it's not true in
True.
this absolute sense, right? Uh, so a lot of people take issue with Rorty because they can't say goodbye to that kind of realism
Hmm.
for a couple of reasons. I mean, one reason might be that it's somewhat uncomfortable. I mean, I think what Rorty would often say is something like, "Well, of course they don't want to give that picture up. That's how they make a living,"
Yeah.
you know. But to be a little bit less cynical about that, someone might approach Rorty and say, it goes back to that sort of thing I was saying, where if you replace the question, "Is it true?" with "Does it work?" isn't the fact that it works evidence for some kind of mind independent reality? Like, doesn't it seem like the concept of X being effective or X working is parasitic on, Y is true, something is true,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it seems like you can't really get to the idea of X will work under these circumstances without already having in place the idea it is true that, these conditions obtain, for instance, you know.
Yeah.
Um, and so people would accuse Rorty of
Mm.
going too far. I think that's the typical refrain with Rorty, that everybody thinks he goes too far, but nobody can agree on how he goes too far. But one way that he's accused of going too far is moving from the claim that, say, science is in the business of constantly revising theories to the claim it is impossible to arrive at a final theory.
Mm. No.
Right. So, yeah, so that one could say that I don't think Rorty ever explicitly says it that way. He tries to get around that question by saying that whether or not it's possible to arrive at a final vocabulary, um, it is very destructive to try to do that to human freedom, to human society,
Mm.
right? So that because most of the time, I don't know. I mean, maybe in certain pure sciences, in certain branches of mathematics, maybe you can make a pretty strong claim that people have come up with the final word on certain questions.
Yeah.
I think he would probably say that whether or not you have the final word on a question is going to be relative to the vocabulary you're using.
Mm.
And what vocabulary you choose is not itself um, necessary, right? Like,
Mhm.
the vocabulary you choose is going to be a function of your interests, and your
Right.
interests are actually driving the questions you ask. And you could
Yeah.
have the final word on a question within a certain vocabulary, but that doesn't mean that you're tapping into metaphysical truth or something. It's just that with respect to the vocabulary you've chosen, it's structured in such a way that you can have things that have the function of a final answer, but that's relative to the vocabulary.
Right.
I think you'd say something like that, probably.
I mean, that's how science experiments work, right?
Well, yeah,
Like,
right. And actually, that's related to what Kuhn has to say, right, with paradigm shifts. Right?
hmm
A paradigm shift is supposed to be a moment that it's really a vocabulary shift.
yeah.
Questions that work in one vocabulary or that seem important or that could have a final answer in one vocabulary, if you just switch the vocabulary, those questions are either irrelevant or not interesting
Yeah.
or continuously open-ended,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I do remember I read Rorty's Contingency, Irony, Solidarity about 6 months ago, and I remember that he takes issue with that in Kuhn. I
Mm.
think so one thing which is kind of interesting is there's maybe a little bit of a tension between that claim about the incompatibility of paradigms.
hmm
Actually, there's a question whether or not Kuhn is claiming that paradigms are incompatible, but to the extent that one simply replaces another one, it's not necessarily because they're incompatible, but de facto, oftentimes they are incompatible, at least with respect to their interests,
hmm
right? That is often taken as one bit of ammunition for that side. And for the opposing side, you get Donald Davidson and his article on the very idea of a conceptual scheme.
Mm.
And the basic claim with Donaldson is that um, it's only possible for you to encounter an opposing vocabulary, an opposing language, or an opposing perspective if it's the sort of thing that you can at least recognize as a perspective or as a vocabulary. In other words, you don't think that rocks are trying to communicate something to you. And maybe
hmm
they are, right? But their modes of communication are so different from your own that it would be impossible to translate. And just because of the impossibility of translation, you can't even recognize that they have a viewpoint. You can't even recognize that they have some kind of conceptual scheme. What
Yeah.
Dixon argues is that if it's even possible to recognize a different conceptual scheme, it means it's translatable into your own conceptual scheme.
Mm.
So, yeah, the idea is that so like people talk about how the Inuit people in the North Pole have 40 words for snow, and that's supposed to give them some insight into the world or some way of looking at the world that we don't have,
Mm.
right? That's like a typical example, right? Or whatever
Yeah.
example is that you want. But what Davidson would say is that, well, but that's not really a different conceptual scheme because you can translate. You could learn to recognize the 40 different kinds of snow.
Yeah.
You could learn
Yeah.
to name them and so on, right? So the point is that if it were the case that it were impossible to translate into your own conceptual scheme, you wouldn't be able to recognize that phenomenon as a conceptual scheme,
Right.
right? And so that's supposed to be against Kuhn and the strong version of Kuhn's uh, um, theory that holds that paradigms are incommensurable. Right.
Mm.
Kuhn does talk about the incommensurability of paradigms, right? But there, I guess it would be more like the incommensurability of interests,
Yeah.
right? Like, for instance, I could have the interest to, let's see, I could have the interest to go to sleep and get a good
Mhm.
night's rest, or I could have the interest to party all night. And those are
Yeah.
incommensurable.
Yeah.
Not because I don't understand
Yeah.
or couldn't do
Right.
follow one of the interests. It's just you can't do both.
Yeah.
I think that that's maybe a way to think about Kuhn's incommensurability. Not that
hmm
it's they're different languages exactly in
Yeah.
the sense of not even being able to translate
hmm
one, but simply if you think of vocabularies as being expressions of interest, then you can see that there are competing interests that are incommensurable.
Hmm.
But that doesn't then, it doesn't follow from that that it's incommensurable in the sense of not understandable or completely like a totally different language or worldview. I mean, it might be related to a different worldview or something, but
Yeah.
um, it's incommensurable because if you think instead of thinking of incommensurability epistemically, if you think about it pragmatically, simply by virtue of the fact that some actions are incompatible with some other actions,
Hmm.
then it's not too hard to see how you could have different scientific paradigms be incompatible or incommensurable,
Yeah.
right? And that's the position that Rorty takes
Mm.
in contingency, irony, solidarity. What he wants to say is that among other things, the purely relativist position, that is to say that everybody has their lived experience and you can't possibly know what it's like to be whatever, black and oppressed or something, whatever,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
it is actually uh, like a sort of form of violence,
Mm.
right? It's a form of there's a sort of violence to it, which is to say that uh, for one thing, or maybe you could call it a form of oppression or something. It is a way of imprisoning people in their viewpoints, right?
Yeah.
Which is to say, if it's really true that it's impossible for me to translate your experience into my own understanding of my experience, then we're both trapped in our prisons, and we can never have the third part of that title, solidarity,
Yeah.
right? And so yeah, so that is what I think Rorty would say to the claims about relativism, right? That it's not really relativistic, it is anti-authoritarian, right?
Yeah.
His approach is saying, look, the things that we think are authorities over us, we made ourselves,
Yeah.
um, including things like final vocabularies, final viewpoints, and so on, or lived experience or whatever, right? And we shouldn't treat those as, it's not that our lived experience is not valuable in one way, it's just that it can very easily turn into an oppressive authority if what I mean to say is you can't possibly know what it's like to be a white man.
Yeah.
It seems fairly clear when I say it with that particular identity group.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
you protesters, how
Uh,
quaint, I mean, it's like if only you can't understand why Donald Trump thinks it's his right to arrest people that protest against him because they can't understand what it's like to be him. I mean, there it seems like a completely ridiculous argument,
yeah.
you know? But that's basically the argument from that form of strong identity sectarianism, right? I mean, that idea that there are distinct lived experiences of maybe certain groups or even certain people that can't possibly be translated into other people's experience. There's something pretty oppressive about that.
Yeah. So there, it's not like you don't know what the conceptual scheme is. It's here. It sounds like it has to do with interest. Like when someone
Yeah.
says,
So, right. Yeah. I mean, if you translate that claim about lived experience in terms of interests, maybe it's a little bit more plausible. But then it also loses the sort of moral authority of it, right? So, like, what I mean by that is if I say as a black woman that I have special insight into the ethics of oppression,
hmm,
then, and it's because of my lived experience, because of the fact that I can't be wrong about how things seem to me
yeah,
at level, then what I'm saying is, I have, by virtue of my experience, a sort of moral authority that is certain because my experience doesn't lie, even if even if I might be wrong about the political causes of it or whatever, I still know what it's like to be oppressed. I still know what it's like to suffer and so on. And that gives me some certainty, gives me some moral authority.
Hmm.
But there it's epistemic. But if I say something like, I know what it's like to be oppressed because I have certain interests and I'm not able to realize my interests, right? I'm not sure that that's really moral. It's just that everybody has interests, and if all we're doing is comparing the how successful we are at realizing our interests, then it's just a sort of self-interested war of all against all.
Yeah.
I mean, so that would be the problem with it, right? It's like it's true that you solve the epistemic problem by talking about it with interest there, but just because lived experience is usually related to moral claims, if it's then expressed only in terms of interests of competing groups, it's not easy to see how that's moral in a very satisfying sense, unless by moral you mean everybody should just try to get what's best for them.
Yeah.
But then if somebody is unable to get what's best for them, that's not moral. It's not a moral failing. It's a, I don't know, physical failing or something like that, whatever. I mean, this is actually close to what Nietzsche argues in the first essay in The Genealogy of Morals, right? I mean, and that's probably like a more accurate way to describe
Hmm.
lived experience talk, you know.
Hmm.
But the problem is that another way to say it is whenever I invoke my special insight as an oppressed person, really what I'm trying to do is assert my interests, is trying to get the upper hand, trying to get
Hmm.
more benefits for myself.
Yeah.
And there you can say that, well, if that's moral at all, it's not moral in the way that those people think they're being moral,
Yeah.
right? If we're understanding that in terms of interest.
Right. Yeah.
We should maybe move on to just knocking out the last couple of things in this chapter because there are a couple. We'll try not to get too deep in the weeds. I want to leave by 1:30.
Yeah.
But there are a couple interesting points that we didn't get to last time. So, in response to analytic philosophy and the history of representationalism and Quine and Sellers' kind of half-hearted pragmatism, Rorty um, sort of makes a move towards what he calls at first, I think it's epistemological behaviorism, is what he calls
Hmm.
it. And then, as far as I understand, within like a month after having published this book, he stopped using that term and just started using pragmatism. So, epistemological behaviorism is one description of pragmatism.
Hmm.
And it's that description that suggests that we not think about whether claims are true, but rather ask the question, what are people doing when they make
Wing.
claims?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
And then he has that section on the ethical implications. How much did you get out of that? One thing he says is a lot of his critics raise a problem, uh, specifically ethical problem, with respect to pre-linguistic children and animals.
Hmm.
Do you remember what the problem is that gets raised?
Oh, yeah, this is again goes back to that idea of sensing versus sensed or
Mm-hmm.
sensible, right? Like um, so yeah, the example that you had here is experiencing pain just as like through the senses, as just like sense data and like knowing
Yeah, but
what pain is.
first of all, what exactly is, I mean, there's an epistemological problem,
Hmm.
which is like how do pre-linguistic children acquire language if it's not
Yeah,
by, being able to attach meanings to sensations or something, right? So that's
right.
an approach that people take. That is an approach that Wittgenstein already rejects in the philosophical investigations this idea that we have ideas that we form through perception that we then just give names to. But still, there, if you're rejecting that picture, then you'd better come up with a theory for how it's possible.
Right.
And that's
Langer brings this up too, right?
Leibniz,
No, Susan Langer in
Susan Leibniz. Yeah, I'm trying to remember. Yeah, that's right. She's
about putting the
right.
cause after the effect in
Well,
terms of
there's
like,
that, right? But then there's also, I think she even makes the claim that language is learned and is in no sense innate, or at least not in any important sense innate. I think that's a claim she makes. Yeah, that I think though is actually closer to the position that Wittgenstein's rejecting. But I don't remember enough of what she says to really flesh that out. But uh, yeah, so what I was going to say though is that what do you remember what Rorty would say to how you go from being a child not using language to using language? Like, how does he think of that?
well, like I think he thinks language is um, it's for like utility, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And that
true.
it does not really alter my like let's say like a representation of an experience, but it's just a way for me to use it in like a social context or
Yeah, that
yeah,
that's one side of it. I think maybe the most kind of direct way that you can describe it though is that just like everything, language is more activity.
right,
Crawling around on the floor or crying or drinking milk or whatever, those are all activities. Language is an activity too.
yeah,
So that's part of it. But then the other part of it is a little bit different in that it is essentially social. Language is essentially social. But the point is not that language suddenly gives you some uh, sudden, conceptual grasp or some kind of meaningful or even truth functional grasp on your experience. You still have the experience, whether or not you have developed a further behavior using words um, in a way that's attached to those uh, experiences or whatever. What he does say, though, is that it's not that learning the word for pain gives you somehow now a deeper awareness of pain. What it does is simply um, inaugurate you into a language community. In
yeah.
other words, now what it is now you can start to have pain in a way that um, can motivate behaviors that are social
Mm-hmm.
and that have a fairly uh, complex set of social possibilities with respect to further action. Another thing he says, though, as kind of an analogy, is that it's really basically like this. Look, when a kid, at least in the United States, turns 18,
Mm-hmm.
nothing has changed about the kid. What has changed is that society now gives that person rights and responsibilities they didn't have before.
Yeah.
And that's what using language gives you too. It's not that it gives you some new mental power in the sense of being able to uh, call things true or know that things are true or whatever. What it simply does is inaugurate a set of rights and responsibilities with respect to society, which is really just another way of saying what I just said, which is that it makes it possible to have further actions that are motivated by the pain that can hook up with social structures,
Yeah.
right? But it's that hooking up with social structures that is the inauguration into the language community,
Right.
right? But you can think of it straight through as just more behavior,
More behavior. Yeah.
right? That language is behavior, society is behavior,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and there's different kinds of behavior. They have different properties, or at least they have different ways of being expressed and so on. But just like if I move my eyes, that's different from moving my tongue or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, there are
Yeah.
more differences than that, but
Right.
The point is that it's just like that kid turning 18. Um, when the kid turns 18, it's not like they suddenly have a lot of wisdom or a lot of when we say that the child is now responsible for their actions, it's not because some anything's changed in their brain,
Hmm.
right? That's not to say that language is not somehow, doesn't use the brain or whatever. So it's only an analogy, but the point is that we shouldn't think of language as being primarily something that enhances consciousness
Hmm.
or makes, or at least even makes possible certain awarenesses that we didn't have before, like the awareness of pain. What it does is simply allow people to uh, react in ways that are motivated by their pain that can be recognized by others. And uh, I suppose the question of responsibility is also sort of interesting. I mean, one of the things that it means to have language is to be taken to be responsible for your actions in a way.
Hmm.
That is to say, your linguistic actions. If I make an assertion, to the extent that you treat that as a belief I have, you're saying, I hold you responsible for your belief. And if I say something that contradicts my belief, then you say, you're responsible for, not playing the game.
Yeah.
That is to say that there's a sort of responsibility that we impute to people who use language. Um, but that in itself is a behavior, the imputing of responsibility. But then also, really, what it is a way of describing a rule governed activity, having a conversation, making claims about things that is really no different from other activities, except that it follows a certain set of rules.
Yeah.
Maybe not directly causal or something like that. And then there's uh, the ethical thing, which is that if language is what's required, for instance, for like those rights and responsibilities to be bestowed on people, then doesn't that leave out animals and non-human or not non-human, human children and animals?
Hmm.
What's Rorty's response to that? Actually, I think you kind of have to add Peter Singer to. Rorty doesn't spend a lot of time on this, and he doesn't use a key word, which I think is actually necessary for his argument to work. Um, or if he does use it, he kind of underplays it, so it's easy to miss. But
Oh, what's the keyword?
so the question is, if language is that thing that, or that sort of activity that bestows rights and responsibilities on people,
Hmm.
and among the rights and responsibilities are the rights and responsibilities of ethics, then doesn't that leave out animals and
Yeah.
children, your pre-linguistic children, in which case we could be completely unethical to children or animals as well.
Yeah.
So then what's his response to that? It's there in
That
it's there in the outline if you want to look, but you could also try to think of a response yourself.
yeah, so yeah, right. The argument would be, oh yeah, we can leave out animals and um well, yeah, and then he would say that language does not give you access to someone's like subjective experience, right? Um
That's true. Yeah.
so
I think
um
you have to get to his response, you have to start from the opposite direction, I think. And answer what how would Rorty answer this question? How do we determine in if we're being pragmatists,
yeah,
how do we determine whether to treat an animal or a child or another person ethically? How do we determine that? Obviously, it's going to be based in behavior,
yeah.
but from a behavioristic perspective, what? is required for us to act ethically towards other people or animals or whatever.
To have like moral laws or
Nope. No, not moral laws. That's foundationalist, not pragmatist.
yeah.
Yeah, maybe it's maybe kind of hard to get to this idea just because we're so, especially after having taken a few years of philosophy, it's hard to stop thinking in a philosophical way. Um, let's say you are on an alien planet and there are a bunch of rocks and I don't know, some other alien things. And then there's this being, something that comes up to you and what sort of behavior would it have to be doing for you to, for instance, feel compassion towards it?
Hmm. Um, yeah, just any sort of resemblance to me, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's it.
yeah,
That's it.
yeah, yeah.
That's it. That's exactly it. It's what he notices, his description of ethics, ethics talk as a sort of behavior is that, well, first of all, you have to think about it in terms of the sphere of moral concern.
Hmm.
Every philosopher who has an ethical theory leaves out some things as not being the sort of thing that we have to worry about ethically, like rocks.
Yeah.
You can use rocks however you want, according to Kant. Just so happens, according to Kant, it's not immoral to be cruel to animals, except for the fact that it might make you more cruel to humans later on.
Hmm.
But, you know, animals don't have any ethical rights because they're not rational in Kant's estimation. So everybody's got something in their moral theory that some entity or huge, vast collection of entities. In fact, the majority of all possible entities are not things we have to worry about,
Yeah.
which is to say, everybody's got a sphere of moral concern. They're only
Hmm.
concerned about certain things that are in that sphere. So then the question is, who's in the sphere and who's not? Well, according to Rorty, it's just those entities are in the sphere of moral concern that we are able to imagine being like us in, say, a state of suffering. What he says is that um, moral concern is really just a way of describing our ability to imagine this thing asking for help.
You know that yeah, this is like maybe it's like problematic, but the experiments where they yeah, take one social, one race, like a group of people, and then they show them what's the experiment? Yeah, where like they show them like a bunch of people who are in distress or whatever, but and then the experiment is that like, oh, they're always favored towards their own in group,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, because
Well, right.
somehow,
Yeah,
yeah.
but I mean, the point there, so what Rorty would say there is that a lot of people don't have very powerful ethical imagination.
Mm.
So that people that seem actually like almost exactly like them, but just have a different skin color or maybe even are wearing a shirt that has a political party they don't like or something, they can't see them as sufficiently like themselves to warrant moral concern,
Yeah.
right? I mean, um, and what he says is that the history of ethics isn't about really getting new moral theories or more moral laws or rules or this sort of thing. It's simply we have one rule. Are you like me and do you need help? Or
Yeah.
are you not like me, whether or
Hmm.
not you need help? And really, what the history of ethics is just a history of the growth of moral imagination such that the circle gets bigger and we bring in more people, more animals, maybe even the earth,
Hmm.
whatever, right?
Hmm.
But it comes down to how well we can imagine this suffering behavior,
Hmm.
behavior that requires help, to
Hmm.
be like my own.
Hmm.
And that's not to say that, a spider that is in distress is very much like me when I'm in distress. But if I can imagine some way in which it is like me, then I act ethically towards it. It could also be understood in terms of interests and so on. Like, why is it that people feel bad about killing spiders but not cockroaches? I actually think cockroaches are cuter than spiders. But most people, when they say, yeah, it's really fun to kill cockroaches but not spiders, it's because the spiders work within our interests and cockroaches don't,
Mm.
right? So that's another way of imagining how they are like us, right? They do the things that we are thankful for that we would do, like kill insects. But the point is simply that ethics isn't about knowledge or logic or moral law. Ethics is about imagination. How
Yeah,
well imagine.
it's interesting that as a pragmatist, he places the faculty of imagination so high up in,
Well, you just have to think of imagination as another activity.
yeah,
The thing about imagination is that it's actually not that surprising because no one, I mean, certainly no philosopher treats imagine. Well, let's see, Kant. I don't know. I have to think. Kant has a very specific meaning by imagination, and I think it's not really the same thing as when we normally use that word imagination in the sense of like storytelling or something.
yeah. I think it was like Plato or Aristotle who kind of spoke against the faculty of
Yeah,
imagination.
well, Plato speaks against mimesis.
Mm.
Um, I don't know that he's really developing a theory that is very close to what we now mean post, say, 19th century as imagination, what we mean
Mm.
by imagination. What Rorty is saying simply is that, well, first of all, imagination is not about truth, in at least not in the sense that philosophers are interested in,
Hmm.
right? Because if I'm telling a story and it's all my own imagination, it's not true in the most obvious sense of correspondence to reality. If it's true at all, it's true in the sense of um, my ability to uh, develop my sympathy, right? And what I
Yes.
mean by that is like if I tell a story like I don't know, like Romeo and Juliet or something, right? And it's imaginative or whatever, to the sense that that story is true, it's talking about something like quote unquote the human condition. But
Mhm.
what I mean by the human condition is um, a regularity of my ability to sympathize with other people,
Yeah.
right? So the big upshot for this, though, which is great for artists, is that he thinks that ethics is actually a branch of art and not philosophy,
Mm.
right? Because ethics is really just about imagining other viewpoints, imagining other ways of life, in fact, even quite different alien ways of life. That
Hmm.
if you can imagine a spider as being sufficiently like you to warrant moral concern, you do that not because there's a Kantian style argument for it, but just
Hmm.
because you have a soft spot in your heart for spiders, because you can imagine spiders as being like you, or at
Hmm.
least as being related to your own interests in a way that warrants treating them ethically, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a huge thing in his response to the critique of what does behaviorism have to say about animals and children, in particular with respect to ethics.
Hmm.
What he says is it's not a problem at all because ethics isn't epistemological, contra Kant, who thinks that it is giving us synthetic a priori knowledge. It's simply about expanding our sympathy towards things. And the way we expand our sympathy is being able to imagine the rest of the world being like us.
Yeah. And I think maybe, I mean, we have spoken about this a bunch, but like this is where maybe music out of all the arts becomes interesting
Yeah.
because you can elicit sympathy without having any sort of direct relationship to like some object in the real world, right? Or like states of
Yeah,
affairs.
the claim here is often made that unlike literature where you can actually like read a book from the point of view of some, medieval Japanese monk or something, you
Hmm.
can't do that with music exactly. So sometimes people try to do it where they say, well, what music does is enable emotional imagination,
Hmm.
right? It helps us develop our emotional imagination to, even if we've never experienced deep sadness, maybe a piece of
Hmm.
music and making us feel deep sadness, or at least making us imagine what it must be like to experience deep sadness, can do this. I don't think that that argument works very well for a couple reasons. For one reason, certainly with like the music that we write, it's not super clear how much emotion plays a role. But also, I think quote unquote experiencing deep sadness in a piece of music is way different from really experiencing deep sadness. And I don't think it gives you
Yeah,
any special insight into the real deep sadness because it's
yeah,
always, I guess there's always a kind of pleasure in deep sadness, even when it's the real kind. But usually when you're in the deep sadness, it's not immediately pleasurable. It's maybe
yeah,
pleasurable 10 years later when you're thinking about it.
right.
Um, but yeah, another way to look at it is, Francois Truffaut, the film director, once said that every movie about war is a pro-war movie because what movies do, whether or not they're nominally against war, they make it beautiful and exciting
Hmm.
and emotional and
Hmm.
powerful in a rhetorical sense, which is to say they make it really cool
Yeah.
or powerful or touching or whatever, even
Hmm.
if they're saying, oh yeah, it's bad too.
Right.
And I think that music has the same problem,
Yeah.
that it doesn't actually give us very much insight into grief or sadness or whatever because it's always too beautiful, right? There's
Yeah.
something too stylized or too pleasurable or whatever about it that, or too aestheticized, which makes it impossible to ever actually give insight into the really strongly painful aspects of it. I don't know. Maybe it's possible. Maybe, there are certain historical moments in the history of music where suddenly dissonance becomes a big thing.
Yeah.
And if you hear a piece that is horrible and ugly, then maybe it can be painful. I don't know. But then it's also treated as a bad piece of music, so who knows? It's fairly
Mhm.
hard to see how. See, so what you would need for that account of music as expanding ethical imagination or emotional imagination, what you would need for that to work is a piece of music that works or is powerful or is considered to be good or well done, that is at the same time deeply painful.
Hmm.
And it's hard to see how you can have both in a piece of music.
Hmm.
For it to be deeply painful, like in a real literal sense of just like confusing and oppressive and not pleasant to experience at all, nobody thinks that's good
Yeah.
for music,
Yeah.
right? And so I think you need both for music to be able to do that, though. And I don't
Right.
see how you can have both.
Yeah.
Maybe you can, but oh, let's blast through one last thing, and then I really have to go.
Okay. Yeah.
The one thing that I think is important is what he calls the idea.
Hmm.
Um, so he's talking about how Quine rejects the idea, which is the idea that meaning is like a mental object in the head. It rejects intentionality as something distinctly mental and so on, which is to say that like one example of this would be the idea that when we speak, what we're doing is taking an idea that's in our head, say maybe an intentional reference to an object or whatever, or a meaning or something, and then finding the words to translate that internal meaning into a sentence meaning.
Hmm.
So it holds there's a distinction between, say, the meaning in your head and the meaning as it's translated into a speech act.
Yeah.
And what Rorty and Quine basically do is say, Actually, meaning arises in speaking. It's not that there is this sort of pure class of adequate concepts or true propositions or whatever that we then translate. It's that meaning arises when it is expressed.
Mm,
So that's the rejection, right? That's the idea of getting rid of the idea that there's this idea that is somehow pure or foundational or something that is then
right.
translated into language.
Mm,
I think from the point of view of music, one way to look at that is it's anti-teleological in the following sense. A lot of times, certainly people, when they talk about music, or even sometimes when you're writing music, you think you have an idea that you're trying to express in the material. But on this account, it would be something more like the idea only comes about when it's expressed, right? So I think you have firsthand knowledge of what that's like, right?
yeah, yeah. No, it's funny because like this is what Jonathan was sort of like cribbing to me about that. Like he has the hardest time. He has like this idea in his head, and then putting it on paper is like really difficult for him, and it never comes out the real way.
Well, that's probably because, I mean, if Rorty is right, or if Quine is right in this, of course it doesn't come out because it doesn't exist until it's out.
Yeah.
All right. I mean, that's with music, it's interesting. It's much easier to understand this or to imagine how this argument works than with meaning, because it still feels very strongly like, well, look, if you can have two sentences in different languages mean the same thing, then isn't meaning independent of language?
Hmm.
So that's a typical argument against this. And I guess I don't think Rorty specifically addresses that in this chapter, but I guess what he would have to say is something like, no, it's just that both in German and in English, when you say whatever, snow is white or Schnee ist weiß, the meaning only comes about as a function of the speech act.
Yeah.
And it just so happens that relative to German, it has a kind of isomorphic function as the meaning has relative to the English sentence.
Hmm.
That's not to say that there's some, sort of Platonic meaning that is independent of its expression.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is also that philosophers always deal with these really kind of boring and nearly atomic sentences, something like snow is white. But when you're dealing with literature, it's much more obvious that the specific way that you uh, express an idea is what the idea is,
Right.
and so there is a sort of an aesthetics here, a sort of suppressed aesthetics in this critique of the idea because there's kind of like with Kant's aesthetics, there's maybe sort of a sense that there's a uniqueness to the meaning of different formulations that are taken to be synonyms or equivalent, right? That actually they're going to be somewhat different. Actually, the
Hmm.
way that Quine deals with it is as follows. What Quine says, so there's this article, maybe you've heard of this, where there's like an anthropologist that is studying some new language in the Amazon or something, and they see a rabbit go by, and then the tribe always says "gavagai, gavagai," and then the anthropologist has to figure out what does "gavagai" mean.
Uh-huh.
And so, like, the thing is that it could mean rabbit, or it could mean running,
Running.
or
Yeah.
it could mean rabbit part,
Right.
undetached rabbit part, or whatever. And so maybe there are different ways of trying to figure out what these things mean. But how do you figure it out? What you do is um, basically ask, like, with respect to how they behave. If I pick up the whole rabbit and point at it and I say gavagai and they laugh at me, then I know that
It's
that was
not the.
false. That was
Yeah.
false, but I only know that because of their behavior,
Yeah.
right? Um, what Quine essentially argues in this is that let's say that you have something like rabbit or rabbiting time slice.
Rabbiting time slice.
Rabbiting time slice. So what I
Uh,
mean by rabbiting time slice is if you have a substance ontology, then you'll say rabbit. If you have a process ontology, then you'll say rabbiting time slice
oh, okay. Uh-huh.
or something like that. Now, here's the thing. If I am trying to translate from this completely unknown language into mine, how am I going to know if they mean rabbit or rabbiting time slice? Well, it's just going to be based on what difference it makes in behavior, what difference it makes in practical activity,
Right.
right? So, in other words, if you have two terms that might mean something different, but make no difference whatsoever to activity, they mean the
Mm.
same thing.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
That's the basic claim, right?
Yeah.
That's the direction Quine takes it. But you could also take it in an aesthetic direction, in somewhat the opposite direction, perhaps, that every way of formulating a sentence has somewhat different meaning, and no two sentences that use different words are ever actually equivalent.
Mm-hmm.
That there's always going to be some,
Yeah.
maybe very slight difference or something like
Right.
that.
Right. Right.
Um, and so, just to finish this out, let me look over my outline really quickly to see where I went with that. Oh yeah. Uh, well, we don't have to worry about sense. Intentions as sets and
Yeah.
abstract objects and stuff. It is kind of interesting, but I don't want to spend more time on that. If you want, you can look up the Stanford Encyclopedia article on the indispensability argument for abstract objects.
Oh.
Um, don't worry about that now. I mean, just a really brief thing. So what Rorty says is, look, the problem isn't with intentionality, that is to say, mental reference towards objects,
Mm-hmm.
because you can think of that as a sort of activity, and that's kind of what
Yeah.
Wyndham was trying to do with the day ray stuff.
Right.
The problem that Quine has, according to Rorty, is with intentions with an
Mm.
S. That is to say, those sort of, platonic meanings. And so what he wants to say is that intentions are actually just sets.
Mm.
We don't have time to explain why sets don't have the immediate problem of intentions.
Mm.
But it has to do with the idea that so if you think about concepts not as platonic forms, but simply as sets, which is to say a summary of the elements in the set, then you can see that you don't have to be metaphysical about meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Is it clear what I'm saying?
Sorry, my phone fell. I didn't get the last word.
Okay. If you think of intentions, that is meanings, not like platonic forms, like the perfect
Mm-hmm.
rabbit is, the concept rabbit or something.
Yeah.
If you think of it instead simply as a set, and here set understood as like a summary of the elements in the set, which I suppose would be like the properties or you don't even have to have them be properties. You could have them be specific atoms or molecules or whatever. To talk about a table is in one way, the word table, the concept table, is like a summary, perhaps a fairly general summary, but nonetheless a summary of all the entities that must be in place in order for a thing to possibly be a physical table.
Mm-hmm.
Is it clear what I'm saying? Here, this will be easier. You know that Gilbert Ryle story where somebody takes a visitor on a tour of a university and they look at the library and they look at the music
Oh, yeah.
and blah, 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 blah. And they look at every single thing, every single rock and every person, everything. And then at the end, the person lists everything that they saw. I saw the library, I saw the music building or whatever, but you didn't show me the university.
Right.
The university is like just the set. It's like a summary of all that stuff. When I say the university, and I mean like the physical uh, object or the physical entity university. Really, what I'm saying is that it's the set of all those entities,
Right.
right? So that university, of course, it doesn't exist as a separate object or a separate extension, except for the fact that it is, you can think of it as just like a summary, which is to say, on the analysis of activity, it's like a labor-saving tool that we use. Instead of having to sit there and list everything, I simply say the word, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So then what the problem is not so much that there's this confusing incompatibility between things like minds and things like physical objects, and somehow physical objects are supposed to make up concepts or meanings or something like that. It's simply that words, concepts like this, are a tool that we use,
Mm.
sort of activity that acts like a tool that saves us some trouble of listing everything all the time or whatever, right? There's no real problem, according to Rorty anyway. Maybe there is a problem. Maybe he doesn't spend enough time on this, but he's saying there's no real problem with having linguistic reference to entities. That is
Yeah.
to say, extension, intentionality in that de re sense. And if we think of intentions, meanings, not as Platonic forms or mental objects, but simply as a kind of behavior that saves us some trouble,
Mhm.
then we have no problem finding ways to talk about, say, atoms moving around on one level and tables on another level.
Right.
And what he says is that the problem that you might think that you have in going from atoms and molecules to tables is the same problem you would have in going from a body to a mind.
Yeah.
It's not a problem,
Right.
as you can think of mind simply as a higher level of description of
Right.
what's going on physically.
Yeah.
And so then what he says is that there are problems when you mistakenly combine levels,
Uh-huh.
right? So like that's where he's talking about, I think it's Davidson who has the idea of heteronomic theories versus homonomic theories.
Mm.
Heteronomic just means you're describing different levels in a way that is incorrect or leads to confusion or something. So that's, like where Descartes is trying to find the thing that links body and mind. So any argument like that is actually heteronomic because bodies are one level of description and minds are another level of description. But if you're thinking of mind simply as a sort of behavioral tool, a concept
Mm.
that we're using
Mhm.
to summarize,
Mhm.
then that problem doesn't arise. And then the next thing he says, and he makes the claim that physics doesn't have any special purchase on the truth. Uh, I won't give you the argument for that. But if that's true, then what follows from that, according to him, is that we could potentially give comprehensive theories in homonomic vocabularies at any level,
Mm.
which is to say that you could give, say, a comprehensive you could have a comprehensive social theory,
Right.
but not because you have to reduce it to physics, but simply because just like physics acts as a homonomic theory, because it's always at the same level of description,
Yeah.
but also if Rorty's right that it doesn't limn reality, is what he says. It doesn't have a grasp on reality, or if it does, it's no different from the way that sociology or literature or history have a grasp on reality. He leaves open the question whether they have a grasp on reality, although I guess actually he doesn't leave that open. He'd say that they don't really have grasp on reality. They're different kinds of behaviors. And
Mhm.
the behaviors have different levels of descriptions. But so physics doesn't really grasp reality in a way that history doesn't.
Mm.
But they are different levels of description. So if you mix them, you'll have all sorts of problems. But if those two previous claims are true, then it must be possible to have within the sphere of history a comprehensive theory because you don't need to refer to physics.
Yeah.
You don't have to reduce history to physics. Uh,
I know that you don't like this guy, Graham Norman. sorry, Graham
Harmon, right?
Harman.
Graham Harmon. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but he has like the same idea, but he uses undermining and overmining.
Oh, yeah.
So undermining is like the act of just like describing something from its like atomic level or whatever, and overmining is like describing it in terms of like states of affairs or
Hmm.
like events or whatnot. And he said like the only two real questions like a philosopher can ask is what something is and what something does.
Hmm.
And
I mean, in a way, that sounds kind of similar to this. I guess the one claim that Rorty's making here that a lot of people would have problems with is that you either can't or don't need to be able to reduce higher level descriptions to lower level descriptions in order to have a comprehensive theory.
right,
Because pretty much every physicist thinks, and a lot of medical doctors think, that everything is explainable in terms of physics or
yeah,
physics plus chemistry.
hmm,
You can reduce chemistry to physics, and you can reduce psychology to chemistry to physics, and you can reduce sociology to psychology to. But nobody's ever demonstrated that that's actually possible
yeah,
comprehensively.
yeah,
And so what Rorty is claiming is you don't need to. He doesn't really give a good. I mean, he's taking the same basic strategy that Quine takes, where it's like nobody's given a good argument for this, so let's tell a different story, which is maybe not that satisfying if what you want is a good argument. But then again, it's also the sort of thing where, as a pragmatist moving away from philosophy towards literature, Rorty kind of thinks that the power is in the story that we tell
yeah,
more than in whether our argument yields the truth.
right,
So, that's how that more or less ends. But I think it's a fairly important uh, element of this essay, this idea of um, different levels of description that nonetheless can be comprehensive.
yeah,
So then what he says is we don't really have to worry for the fate of the humanities. He calls it the Geisteswissenschaften.
mm,
Um, we don't have to worry about that now. That is coming from a slightly different history. I think it's Wilhelm Dilthey who coined that term. But it's like the difference between like physical sciences and, say, social or humanistic sciences. What he's saying is literature, for instance, even can be as much of a comprehensive theory as
hmm,
physics. It's going to be using different vocabularies at a different level of description, but we don't necessarily need to think of it as somehow lesser than or somehow necessarily reducible to physics. We can,
right. It's not like it's like a completely different conceptual scheme like we were talking earlier.
I mean, I guess if that's the question about whether it can be reduced or not. I mean, the thing is that if it can't be in principle reduced, then it is a different conceptual scheme.
Mm.
So if you want to keep open the possibility of, or I guess actually what Davidson would say is the impossibility of different conceptual schemes, which is to say the possibility that you can always translate between them, then it must be, at least in principle, possible to reduce literature to physics, right? So I don't
Mm.
know, and this gets to this thing where it's fairly. I think what we would have to say is both Rorty and Quine kind of sidestep Davidson's question because what Rorty says is that I guess it's possible with that indeterminacy of translation argument. What he's saying is it's at least in principle possible that these people have a different conceptual scheme than I do. Um, but I would never know that. I mean, it's actually kind of similar to it too. So what I think Quine is kind of saying is that it might be possible that other conceptual schemes exist, but it would never be something that I could even recognize because all I can do is recognize that they have behavior that operates in a certain way, in a certain
Mm.
context. And that's all I need to know what something means, which is to say, I'm translating that into my own conceptual scheme. Meaning is activity. But
Yeah,
it doesn't leave out the possibility that they have a different conceptual scheme. And so it kind of doesn't make a difference. If there's no difference practically, if there's no difference to practice, then there's no difference in meaning. It doesn't matter, is what he'd be saying, right?
Yeah, and I guess it doesn't matter for Rorty then that if he's a substance ontologist or a process ontologist because he's holding uh, both ways of looking at something at the same time, right?
Well, to the extent that both of those ontologies are realist and actually are accounts of how reality really is,
Hmm.
he'd be against that.
Yeah,
They're different stories,
right.
you know. And I guess like to the question, like, you know, so like the way that people often try to turn uh say Nietzsche or Rorty into a self-contradiction is they say something like they accuse, say, Nietzsche of saying there's no such thing as absolute truth, in which case that's self-defeating because there's at least one absolute truth. There's no such thing as absolute truth.
Hmm.
But really, what Nietzsche or Rorty would be saying is something like there are stories that we tell that justify themselves. They're not justified based on something outside of themselves, they're justified internally through the rules of giving and taking reasons, through the rules of inference, if it's logic or something like that, but not because they grasp onto reality, but simply because there's a certain sort of consistency, but the consistency is internal to the story itself.
Yeah,
And then if you say, but isn't it mind independently true that that story is consistent? I think Rorty would say, I don't know what you're talking about. Like that doesn't make any sense because no, the story is the thing that's self-consistent.
yeah,
It's the story, right? It's not mind independent reality or the correspondence between the story and reality or whatever. It's just the story that's consistent.
yeah,
Yeah. So I think that's how we get out of it. But anyway, I think that that's probably
yeah.
good introduction to neo-pragmatism, Rorty, and so
Mhm.
on. I don't know if you want to read anything else. You
Let
could read,
me.
if you wanted to continue with Rorty, it might be good to read some of Contingency Solidarity or Contingency Irony Solidarity, just because there he's talking mostly about literature, art and literature,
Mm, mm.
not so much of the logic stuff or the opinion
Okay,
stuff.
okay,
But if you want to move in a different direction or something, that's fine too.
okay. I'll. Oh yeah, I have that list from you, so I'll look at that
Oh
list
yeah.
and see.
So if you want to keep doing philosophy of mind stuff, we could do that. I've already read Contingency, Irony, Solidarity, so I have plenty of stuff to say, and I know
Oh, okay.
where it goes and whatever. And it's also kind of interesting because he has a chapter on Derrida. He has a chapter on Nabokov, uh,
Mm.
and who else? Anyway, novelists and continental philosophers and stuff.
Okay.
It's a kind of nice mix of different things.
Yeah.
But it continues out of many of the basic ideas from this.
Mm.
So you maybe take a look at it and see if it's something you want to do. Otherwise, take a look at some of the things on that list and we can come up with something.
Okay. All right.
Yep. All right.
Yeah. Thanks.
Later. Bye bye.
Bye.